We are now going to transition over to Dr. Joe Vendarmini. So Dr. Vendarmini received his bachelor's degree in Brazil and his master's degree there as well, correct? Okay. Then he came to the University of Florida and got his PhD. He spent a year at Texas A&M University before returning to Florida and the Owner Research Center in 2006. Besides research in forage management, he's been increasing producer awareness of forage testing as important parts of his work here, which I've used quite a bit. And I'm sure you all have heard of the Joe What podcast. So that's where he's become famous. So we're going to let you take over and give us your presentation.
I would like to start by reflecting a little on the 80 years of the research center. So I think after all these 80 years, a lot of things change on the science and methods that we use to produce science here with cattle and forages. Such as in my program, you just heard Jaime presenting about ecosystem services, greenhouse gas emissions, and studying the microbiome of soil and sometimes in the rumen of the animal. Yes, some technologies change, but I also would like to highlight that a lot of things didn't change, such as the search that we have for better forage that will be aligned with the interest of our producers to make their production more sustainable and more efficient and translating more in profitability. So we here at the research center, if you go back, since Dr. Hodges, we always have been doing that kind of work and trying to search for forages that will make livestock production better here in the state of Florida. With that in mind, so a little history here, we released Pangola in the 60s here at the center and became a quite popular forage all over the state of Florida and also in tropical countries. And I think we keep doing that. And the last few years, we released new cultivars such as Gib Duck and High on the limpo grass standpoint. And 2 years ago, we just released Miss Levy. So I think those are work that we keep doing with the history that we have here, trying to find the forage that will make production of livestock here a little better. And one thing that I think we are missing is a lot of these forages that we have focused here and we found are most of them are propagated by vegetative material, right? We here in South Florida, we have a very unique condition on the climate and soil standpoint, right? And we need to test those forages that, first of all, will survive because we have the culture of perennial forages, right? If you plant something that will not persist, I think will not fit well in our system here. A lot of beef cattle producers, although they may have a tractor and other equipment, they don't want to be planting and prepare land every year. Many times they cannot even do that because it gets too wet in the summer. So we are not able to do that. So these differences in the state, drive us to trying to always be searching for these new forage species. As I mentioned, a lot of the forages that we have are planted by vegetative material. And if you have been involved in that process, you know how painful it is, right? Not only to plant, but also to prepare the plant material. The window that you have, the time that you have to spend growing the forage to be mature enough, fertilizing and weed-free. And then when you harvest, you need to put in a bale and move to a different place. So that is a lot of work compared having a bag of seed, correct? So we do have a very popular forage, bahia grass, that is planted by seed. But we know the bahia grass is the best because it persists, but has a lot of limitations on the nutritive value and forage production. So with that in mind, so I think we just a little picture here remind our focus on the planting vegetative material. We have semi trucks that load all those bales, and then the producer get here on close to on and said that one tire blew up. right? Because it has too many bays. So, and that is the life of trying to plant this vegetative material. It's not easy. So with that in mind, we are trying, as I mentioned, we are trying to find new cultivars and species, but also to find something that will be easier, right? And one of the focus of my program is trying something that we can plant by seed that will persist and survive in South Florida. So I have here a list of cultivars that is the current one that we are trying. And I did some preliminary work. That's what I'm going to show you today. But I also think that was rewarded with support from the producers, that we have a really close connection, because the further work that we are doing this year is funded by the Dairy Checkoff program and by the Florida Cattlemen Enhancement Board. So we have different projects on grazing and harvesting these forages, and they are all funded by our stakeholders. So I'll talk to you a little bit about the history of those grasses. So I have been doing work with these brachiareas for a long time. I try several here, and they are very different because the genus is the same, species is different. And then many years ago, they come up from Colombia, from the CIAT. They have those hybrids, right? That were much better for the nutritive value standpoint, but they lost a lot on persistence. So, and they have probably 150 different hybrids. I came by this Camelo because it's a hybrid with a very different characteristic, that it is not as upright as most of you have heard about the mulatto, or even the old Brachiaria brisanta that we have here in South Florida. So it's much easier to manage and produce a lot of seed. That is also very important for persistence. So I went through this grass when I was in Brazil, and the company showed me what it looks like. I said, well, probably has some potential to be. And the seed propagation is done in Thailand, in a place with a little higher latitude. So I felt that may have a promise to be cultivated here. So I brought to Florida and try. So this is a release cultivar. It's commercial, right? So the other one that is, I think, is a little more interesting is this Spain. I went to Spain to talk about sun hemp. That's the work that we have doing in sun hemp. So touring, and they have a lot of alfalfa there. It's probably the main crop, is Mediterranean climate, very dry. They produce a lot of alfalfa. So one of the fields, the guy had this. And this is not a commercial cultivar. It's just a cultivar that was part of the CIAT data bank, but this guy brought from Colombia to Spain and became perennial there. So it's pretty cold. It's very high altitude. So sometimes it's snow and they still have the grass there. And one thing that is good is doesn't produce seed. Good for us because it doesn't have the option to be invasive. But it produces seed in tropical areas. If you are lower latitude, it has long days for a long time, so it may produce seed. I saw that and brought it here as well to compare with the grass that we have. And as I said, we want something that's more productive and has better nutritive value, so we compare with jigs, right? That is something that has been around for a long time, is persistent for us, and I think a lot of producers in Florida has it. The last one is the Mombasa that I was not very excited because it's difficult to find here for us a seed that will have very good germination. So we fail establishing the stands for a little while. So then it was, but we got a good stand in Gainesville when we established. So I think those variations, I think maybe a problem with seed production. That is not something that we are looking for to have another problem when we try to establish a grass. So just some data here from ONA. This is the herbage accumulation comparing Camelo, Spain, and jigs during the whole year. As you can see, it's pretty evident that on the production standpoint, both are quite superior to jigs. And this place is relatively wet. I would say is the driest spot at the research center, right? That is in a place where we have the forages there, but it is still wet. So it takes some wet, and that was very promising, but you can see the herbage accumulation was really exciting, I think, on those. Those are 2-year data, that preliminary data that we did. The nutritive value, they are quite comparable. The protein standpoint, I think it's still quite good for improved grass that we use. You can see the jigs have some spikes there in protein, but it was primarily because it didn't produce much, so it didn't dilute the protein in the herbage mass. But we saw very little difference. So it's quite similar. You can expect quite similar protein concentration compared to the jigs. On the digestibility standpoint, it was a different story. So these grasses are really leafy, and you can see digestibility of both were better than jigs. And we do believe that the Bermuda grass here for us are grasses with good nutritive value as long as you manage well. And those are actually superior to jigs. So I think it's another very promising result. So with that in mind, these brachiaria and panicum genus, one main concern is the cold tolerance, because they are sensitive. They are very tropical forages. So what we did, we also set up a trial in Gainesville, actually Citra, but most of you are familiar with the Citra unit there. It's close to Gainesville. And then we have those 4 different species testing, same trial, just generate some basic information to see what it looks like. And then you see here, again, how the Camelo in Spain was superior to jigs. Actually, the difference was greater than was here. So that was also very promising. Nutritive value standpoint, I think they, again, very similar here to ONA, is quite, the same, I think. But again, with a pretty good energy concentration for our warm season perennial grasses, that I think it's a favorable thing. One thing that we have seen is for many years, we try to select the forests that produce more. And I think we are doing the wrong thing. We are just selecting the one that produce more, and then we plant, therefore it die, right? So then we are trying to get the one, it doesn't really need to produce much more, but the persistence is also something very important in that scenario. Protein data here, but I would like to switch here to the persistence standpoint. So here at ONA, we have those plots now for 3 years, and then they are full cover, 95% ground cover after 3 years, harvesting every 5 months, and now we are harvesting in different intervals. So therefore, it showed me that it's pretty persistent under different managements. Now we are challenging more. But overall, 3 years, I think it's a sign that may be perennial. But when we go to Gainesville, it's a different story, right? So that's why I think it makes our job here a little, I think, more interesting, right? Because we have, as I mentioned, a very specific condition in South Florida that many times what works in Gainesville may not work here and vice versa. So 2020, if you remember, it was a warm winter. They have, I think, 1 frost in Gainesville. So it was very warm. So those grasses did very well. 2021, they have 10 freezing events. 10 times in Citra got below 32, and the lowest was 26, the coldest that it got. I didn't have the duration, but that was the temperature. Look at what happened to those plots. So the panicum pretty much died, right? It disappeared. The Camelo kept pretty good, but we see the jigs is still there, same thing. This Camelo recovered pretty well. I think it's filling up again, but the panicum just died. So with that in mind, we know now that it depends the species that you're going to manage. If you go to Gainesville, probably the panicum may be a biannual or even annual if you have a cold winter. And we are still doing work. We replanted over there. And this is just a picture of the plots after the cold in 2021. This picture was taken in April after the frost. So they are gone, right? So there is a difference there in how cold tolerant these grasses are. And I think we are, as I mentioned, we have this work with the Derek Chekhov that is harvest frequency. And we have the work with the Florida Cattle Enhancement Board that is grazing frequency. So to try to find more information on those forages and to see how they will behave under those conditions. So I think that's the information that I have to share with you. As Laura mentioned, the Joao is very famous. And if I were you, I would watch and listen to it because it will give a lot of information. The current Joao that we will have available probably next week or so, it talks about the cattle feeding conditions and some trade-offs between carcass quality and quantity. So I think it will be a interesting one to watch. I have a question here from Kathy. Have you calculated out the volume rather than the concentration of nitrogen protein from the experimental grasses versus jigs? Yes, and that is pretty evident there because the concentration was the same, but the herbage mass was much greater. So that result, these grasses, the Camelo and the Spain, had a much greater volume of protein produced per area because the production is greater and it still keeps the same concentration. So we did calculate it and it is greater significantly. Thank you.